Okay, well, I'm going to go ahead and get started. Um, as if you're already here, and as you join in, you are free to ask any questions that you may have. Again, guys, I want to welcome you to the first of our installments of the Academic Success Workshop series. First off, I hope that everybody is staying warm and cozy amidst our ice storm and weather predicament. But we are in the business of education, and minds don't stop growing and glowing because of the ice. So I want to welcome you to the first installment of the Academic Success Workshop series. My name is Dr. Carolyn Hall. I am the Associate Vice President for Academic Affairs and Student Success. And I want to welcome you today to this installment, the first installment. This is in our inaugural installment of the Academic Success Workshop series. And I'm extremely excited about it because at Philander Smith College, one of our priorities is always to make sure that our students are academically prepared inside the classroom and outside the classroom. We're always, as our slogan says, moving forward. And so this particular academic success workshop is called Hours and Hours, Learning to Study Without Distraction. Learning to study without distraction. Um, Unfortunately, I am unable to put the I'm unable to put the actual uh, PowerPoint on the screen since this is a live YouTube video. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put that in our actual chat. I'm going to put this information in our actual chat for you to be able to follow along. So since this topic or since this workshop is about learning how to study without distraction, one of the first things I want to address, as always, is this misnomer that, a lot of times we have students that come in, and soon as they get to college, one of the first things that they'll say is that they never had to study in high school, right? And so they feel like that because they never had to study in high school and they made good grades in high school without ever having to study, that it's sort of crazy to now try to pick up study habits that they never had before, right? And then they've heard these crazy things like, you don't really have to come to class when you get to college. You just have to make sure you turn in your work. I want to put all of those fallacies, right? Fallacies are lies that are usually passed on as truth. I want to put all of those fallacies to rest because one of the things that we've got to understand as we make a transition from high school to college, and even for those of you who are not freshmen, but you're sophomores, your juniors, your seniors, and you never picked up those study skills are key to your academic success. I'm going to repeat that for the folks in the cheap seats. Study skills are key to your academic success. That is an absolute necessity, right? Because one of the things that we have to understand is that college is a lot more rigorous, right? A lot more rigorous, a lot more engaging than high school is. And you said, well, Dr. Hall, what do you mean when you say that college is a lot more rigorous than high school? What I mean is that in high school, a lot of times we had teachers who would give you 2 weeks or a week or two to go over an assignment, and they would go over that particular assignment day by day, right? But in college, you may receive the syllabus that lists the actual assignments that you do, and you may have less assignments to complete, but the assignments are a whole lot more detailed, right? And the expectation from your professors, from your college professors, is going to be a whole lot greater than the expectation from your high school teachers. So we've got to make sure that when we're studying, right, that we're studying in such a way that we come to class prepared, and that we also know how to do what is being asked of us, right? Because the job of college is not just so that you can graduate with this degree so that you can get a better paying job, but that you graduate with a set of skills and an information process that makes you that makes you different than those who may have just had a high school diploma. That is one of the reasons why you're coming to college, right? So studying is an intricate part of that process, right? So one of the things that I think that is important for scholars to know that they don't usually understand to sometimes too late or sometimes much later down the road, one of the first things that you've got to understand is what type of learner you are, right? What type of learner you are. If you're following along, type in the chat with me so I can make sure that you're here. What type of learner am I? That's one of the first keys that we have to understand as we're learning how to study, right? And learning how to focus without distraction. What type of learner am I? And so there are three types of specific learners. There are three specific types of learners. There is the visual learner, there is the audio learner, and there is the kinesthetic learner. And I know those are sort of big terms, but I want to break those down for you. A visual learner is somebody who needs to see a thing, right? Like you need to have the thing before your eyes to really be able to understand what is happening. So I'll say that again. There is a visual learner, right? The visual learner needs to see a thing in order to understand a thing. So I want somebody to type that in the chat for me. So the first type is a visual learner, and the visual learner needs to see a thing in order to understand it. The second type of learner is the kinesthetic learner. The kinesthetic learner. Kinesthetic. Kinesthetic sounds a lot like you've heard the word kinesiology before, right? That means that I got to touch a thing, right? So a kinesthetic learner is the sort of learner that has to be able to handle objects, to touch things in order to understand how they work. And the last type is the auditory learner. Auditory learner, that's somebody who has to hear something in several different ways in order to be able to understand it. They can't just necessarily look at a thing, but they've got to hear it, right? Got to hear it in several different forms and several different ways in order to be able to understand. Now, I fall into the category because I know what type of learner I am, and the type of learner that I am is a visual learner. I've got to see a thing. I've got to see a thing. Well, the strategies that are important for a visual learner would be whenever you're reading, you want to make sure that you highlight important information in your textbooks, right? Highlight important information in your textbooks. In addition to highlighting, you may have to create charts and graphs and pictures in order to break things down so that they're more understandable for you. You also may be able to create visual study tools like note cards or post-it notes within your text to help you understand things. Second type, when we get to auditory learners, these are people who got to talk a thing through and they've got to hear a thing. So for an auditory learner, one of the things that you may want to do is you may want to video or take the lectures, record the lectures that you're given in class, right? Because you got to play it back to make sure that you're able to process what it is that you've heard. So with the auditory learner, they have to speak it and they got to hear it. So as an auditory learner, you want to make sure that you're recording lectures so that you can play them back in your room or wherever you are. You can even play it back when you're driving, because this is a simple strategy, right? Sometimes students say, well, I don't really have time to study, I work a lot. Well, guess what? If you start recording the lectures that your teachers give when you come to class, you could play that thing just like a book on tape. Play it in your car, play it in your dorm room, and keep listening, and eventually you'll get it. Okay. Another thing that auditory learners do, another strategy that they can do, is they work in study groups because they find it helpful to kind of go over information with other people. They create rhymes and jingles to help them memorize things, right? And one of the things I think that is important to understand is, because there's another fallacy that I want to clear up. Memorizing information is not studying. I'm going to say it for the people in the cheap seats. Memorizing information is not studying, right? Because just because you memorize something doesn't mean that you understand what it is that you've remembered, right? Because what happens is there has to be a connection between what you've heard and what you understand. So just because you hear it doesn't necessarily mean that you understand what you heard. So we don't want to just memorize the things that we hear in class, right? Because a very poor study tactic that a lot of students have is they'll try to memorize information for a test. But sometimes you have teachers that will not just ask you terminology, but they'll ask you how you apply these things. For example, let's say that you're in a language arts class, right? And you're talking about the types of arguments. And so the teacher says, your professor says that they're going to give you a test on the types of arguments, right? So there is I used to teach English, so this comes easy, right? So there is something called a red herring argument, right? Red herring argument means so when you think of a red herring, you think of a bright colored fish, right? This is something that a red herring is something that we use to get someone's attention in an argument, and it causes a lot of ruckus, but it doesn't necessarily have any validity, right? Another type of argument tactic is overgeneralization, right? Overgeneralization means that I kind of lump everything into this one argument and assume that everything is true because one other thing is true, right? So it's called overgeneralization. Another type of argument is a logical fallacy, right? Logical fallacy means that something makes sense, but it's not necessarily true, right? So let's say, for instance, with the logical fallacy, an example of that may be um, Tony went to jail for robbing banks. After Tony got out of jail, 3 banks in his neighborhood were robbed. And so somebody says, "Oh, well, Tony robbed those banks because he just got out of jail for robbery around the same time that these occurred." Well, the logic in that, it makes sense, right? But just because Tony went to jail for bank robbery does not mean that Tony can automatically be accused of being a bank robber at this point in time. Okay. And so you see how what I did when I gave you examples, right? That's application. That means I understood what each type of argument means. And so a lot of times in our classes, rote memorization, and that's what it's called when we memorize things, right? Rote memorization is not helpful because, again, most of your professors they're going to want to see you be able to apply that information to something. So they're not just going to want to for you to be able to write down the definition of something, right? In your biology class, they don't want to just know that you know what a stem is, right? You can say or repeat back what a stem is, but they're going to want to know that you understand what stems are and how important a stem is to the overall, a stem cell is to the overall working and productivity of a person's body. So we want to make sure that while we study, we're able to apply the knowledge that we have. Lastly, going to that kinesthetic learner. If you are a kinesthetic learner, you have to be able to have things like objects, right? Charts, diagrams, things that you can actually touch and feel to help you be able to understand something. And I think this is very, very important, especially for uh, those people who are science majors, right? Those people who are majoring in the sciences. You may be able to, those type of people are usually, I think we call that left brain people, right? So those people usually need to be able to do a process in action in order to understand. Now, going back to all these types of learners, this is extremely important because when you know what type of learner you are, that tends to help you be able to study better, right? That tends to help you to be able to study better. Okay, going back to the original point. So I give you an example. One of the biggest mistakes that I often see when I was a classroom professor, right? One of the biggest mistakes, especially with the advent of cell phones, and though I may not look like it, I've been teaching a long time, right? So, but the more popular cell phones became, the more of sometimes a handicap that it became to many of our students. So I'll give you an example. So, with a lot of students, what they would do a lot of times, instead of actually writing out the notes, they would say, well, Dr. Hall, I'm just going to take a picture of the board. And that's not the Wakanda symbol. That means wrong, not gonna work, right? Tell you why it's not gonna work. In most cases, you're not going to go back to that picture and actually study. Pictures are something that we look at. Follow me here, right? Look at. Remember, even as a visual learner, you got to write it down, highlight it, and see it. This is the process that you take yourself through in order to make sure that you're understanding the information. Taking a picture is not going to automatically emblazon that thing on your mind. It's not that easy, right? And then another caveat there is that a lot of times when students take pictures of the information on the board, as soon as that phone starts running out of memory, you start erasing. You start erasing, right? And before you know it, you've erased something important that happened in class that needed to be committed to memory, but first written down on paper. Okay. So you want to make sure that you're utilizing it's a lot of these tactics, they may seem very old school. And I like to give you words when I'm talking to you. So for many of you, they may seem antiquated. Antiquated means outdated, right? No longer relevant. Like so the root word you hear there is correct, is antique. Okay. So a lot of you may say, well, Dr. Hall, these tactics, they seem antiquated to me. Why do I need to take a pen and a paper to class, and why do I need to write this stuff down when my teacher's talking when I could just record it with my phone and play it back? Folks, I got news for you. Many of us don't have the memories that we think we do. So we really want to go through all of those steps, right? Because even though I'm primarily a visual learner, all types are necessary, especially when we're dealing with more rigorous academic work. And we know that college tends to be a lot more rigorous, meaning there's a whole lot more brain engagement. There's a whole lot more thinking that has to happen. Less busy work, right? Because in high school, we got all these worksheets and extra credit projects that were basically us redoing a bunch of old work. But in college, there's a lot more academic engagement and involvement. The work is a lot more rigorous. For example, when you write an essay in college, that teacher's not just looking for 3 paragraphs. The teacher's usually looking for a 2 to 5 page work where you're including in that research, where you're including in that outside expert opinion to validate whatever points that you're making. Well, if that is going to happen, that means that I've got to be a lot more engaged. There's a lot more rigor that is involved in my college level study. Okay. So, with that rigor, I want to make sure that I'm doing everything possible to not just remember the information, but to be able to understand and process what I've learned. I'm going to say that again. I want to make sure that I not just remember the information, but I want to make sure that I can process the information and apply what it is that I've learned. These are all extremely important because college is going to require application of the information. You said, well, Dr. Howell, give me an example of what that looks like. Okay. So let's say that you're taking a literature course from Dr. Brown, right? And Dr. Brown has you guys reading, uh, I think that is Langston Hughes, I Too Sing America, right? Langston Hughes, I Too Sing America. So when you guys get to class, now mind you, this is a really, really short poem. I forgot how many lines that it has in the poem, but this is a really, really short poem. And so you think, well, I'm just gonna go over this thing. I'm gonna go back to class and we're gonna discuss this. This is an easy A. But when you get to class, surprise, surprise, Dr. Brown is now asking you, what did Langston Hughes mean when he wrote this poem, I Too Sing America? Now, some people may be thinking, I wasn't even born. My grandma wasn't even born when this man wrote this poem. How am I supposed to know what he was thinking? Well, a true scholar understands that I'm not just looking at the words on the page, but I'm looking at what was meant by what was said, right? That's part of studying. So, in order for me to really, really get that thing, I got to look at what is called context, right? I've got to be able to contextualize because, again, that's part of the studying process. This contextualization, this application is part of the studying process. So, if I'm really going to understand this when I go into Dr. Brown's class, because I already know that when I get there, she's not just going to be asking me to recite this poem because that would be useless. Everybody read the same thing. So everybody's going to be able to recite it. What she's really looking for is what did the author mean by what they said? And so in order to be able to give that information, that means that I've got to be able to understand and process what it is that I've heard. I've got to understand and I've got to process what I heard. So if it were me, some of the things that I would do, right? Tricks that I learned along the way as a college student, because just being quite honest with you, I went to this sort of high school I was one of those people. I didn't really have to study when I was in high school, right? It really came easy for me. And now for those classes like AP English or advanced English and that sort of thing, I studied and I read because I liked it. But the other stuff, it came really, really easy. Okay. And that's not bragging, but that's telling you that what happened when I got to college was a shocker. You mean to tell me that I've got to make a time management schedule? You mean to tell me, in addition to going to class, that I've got to set aside time to study? I never had to do that before. I may have what we call crammed before a test so that I can make sure that I could repeat back the information the teacher was looking for, right? I may have, before a project, we had some sort of big project, I may have taken a day or two to get some information together to make sure I got a pretty good grade on my project. But when I got to college, I began to understand that the expectation was different. The expectation was different, right? So the way and how I understood that the expectation was different was because how the information was presented. So I would hear the teacher ask questions like, what time, when did the author write this, right? So going back to Langston Hughes, I Too Sing America, right? So when we talk about this, the teacher's going to be looking for time frame. When was this written, right? So what I've got to do as a scholar and as somebody who's earning this college education, right? Earning this degree, because degrees come a dime a dozen. We want to make sure that our degree is worth the weight of the paper that is held on, right? Because we live in a very, very competitive world. And that means that I've got to make sure that I know what I say I learned. I can't just say, oh, I got this degree from Philander Smith College. I got to know this information. So if I'm coming out a political science major, I've got to be knowledgeable about the world of political science. If I'm coming out an English major or Africana studies major, I've got to be knowledgeable about English and Africana studies. And that goes for all of the fields, right? All fields. And so in order for that to happen, that means that I've got to, one, understand what type of learner I am, and I've got to apply those tools as I study. Now, for many people, they have a difficulty solidifying a time or carving out a time to actually study. And I get it, right? I get it. You know, college is fun. Many people have jobs, and there seems like so much to do and not enough time to do it for so many people, right? So many, and I hear this from students all the time. Well, I gotta work and I gotta do this, and my club, my organization, they having this, and I gotta go to these meetings. I have to go to those meetings. I charge you with this. Your academics is always first and foremost. It is the utmost priority. The utmost priority. Okay. Number two, you can still do many of the things that you would like to do if you learn how to master the art of planning and execution. I'll say it again. You can still do many of the things that you would like to do, right? If you master the art of studying, which means that you've got to have time and execution. We said, Dr. Hall, well, how am I going to do that? And I got a job and I got this and I got that and I got SGA and I got, because this applies to everybody. This is not just for freshmen. This is for everybody. One of the best things that you can do is to create for yourself a time management schedule. A time management schedule. And so I call this workshop Hours and Hours because in order for you to really, really get a good grasp of the information, you need hours of undistracted time to really study. Now, that does not mean that all those hours are going to happen in one day. It does not mean that all of those hours is going to happen in a couple of days, right? It may be chunks of time that you carve out to study, right? And you dedicate more chunks of time to those classes that have more of a challenge for you, right? I don't want to say easier classes because no class is easy. Every class is going to be difficult to someone, right? But the classes that present more of a challenge to you may mean that you need to carve out more time to actually study. Well, you said, Dr. Hall, what does that look like for me? Okay, tell you what it looks like. So let's say that I have a schedule, and my schedule, my classes start at 9 a.m. I was privileged enough to get a class schedule, and I start at 9 a.m. on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. And I am done by 1. Then on Tuesdays and Thursdays, I start at 9:25 and I'm done by 10:15. That's 15 hours, right? 15 hours. Well, on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, I may wake up an additional 30 minutes before my class schedule starts. I'll repeat that. I will wake up an additional 30 minutes before my classes start. And so I'm using that additional 30 minutes to reread the notes that I've taken in class, or maybe even go back over what it is that my professor talked about during class time, right? So after I get out of class at 1, you said, well, Dr. Hall, I got to be at work by 2 and I don't get out to 7. Soon as I get back at 7, I gotta go to a SGA event from 7:30 to 9:30. Okay, you can still do all of that. But when you get back to that room, you can't go to sleep immediately. You need to use that time, at least an hour and a half to 2 hours, to make sure that you're going over the information for your classes, and not just the information for the next day, but every day you need to be making yourself familiar with your classes, right? And if you make a practice of this, you don't have to try to all of a sudden one day a week study for 5 or 6 hours, because you're in the practice of covering your material on a daily basis. And that way, not only am I committing it to memory, but I'm also learning how to apply what it is that I've gained. Okay. Now, for those courses that may be more complex or more rigorous than others, maybe on my weekend or in my downtime, right? When I don't have to go to work, because you're not working 7 days a week, point blank, period. Okay. And if you tell me you're working 7 days a week, guess what I'm going to say? Cap, all cap. Okay. So you're not working 7 days a week. So on those days when you don't have to go to work, you make sure that you dedicate, let's say, 2 to 3 hours of undisturbed time. And in order for that to be accomplished, guess what? We also know that sometimes we got to get away from our roommate. We got to get away from our roommate and our homegirls, our homeboys, and our boyfriends, girlfriends, whatever, right? We've got to take some time away from those people and isolate ourselves, and so that we can be productive. And one of the wonderful things about Philander Smith is that we got a big old beautiful library, multi-million-dollar library. You can head over there, get a study room, or find a secluded corner somewhere and use that time wisely, right? And so, because many of you are learning how to study without distraction, I can understand if you take 5 or 10 minutes to go to social media, but time yourself. There's even these things on your phone that cause you to time yourself in such a way that you make sure that you're not wasting too much time. And so what it does for you is it will create a shut off for you on social media so that you can no longer scroll through, right? So you say to yourself, well, I'm gonna take a little study break and I'm gonna look and see what's popping on Instagram for 15, 20 minutes, right? Make sure that phone is timed to lock at 15 or 20 minutes, because then you need to get back to studying, right? And you need to keep doing this until you develop the sort of focus that will allow you to stop with the additional distractions. It's just like working out, right? Because the brain, and I want you to think of it in this context. The brain is a muscle. The brain is a muscle. And so just like any other muscle, right? When we start working out, and it's been a while since I've been to the gym, I'll tell it on myself. But just like any other muscle, right? We may start off when we go to the gym and we're weightlifting, we may start off with a 3 pound dumbbell, right? Well, after a while, the muscles it's going to require more weight for our body to respond. And so let's say after a week, I may move up to 5 pounds. After another week, I may move up to 7 pounds. Well, our brain is the very same way with information, right? So if you're not used to studying on any sort of consistent basis, if you're not used to focusing on information, it is a matter of training and disciplining yourself. You've got to be able to discipline yourself. And so I may start off with 30 minutes of study here, 40 minutes here, an hour here. Eventually, I'll get to the point where I can study 2 hours undisturbed, 3 hours undisturbed. And we've got to get to that point. Let me tell you why. You got to get to that point, especially for those of us that are planning on going to graduate school, medical school, law school. It is going to require a level of discipline. Even those of us that are planning on going into the workforce after we finish at Philander Smith, our 4-year degree. It requires a level of discipline. And that is why we titled this Hours and Hours Learning to Study Without Distraction, because you got to train your mind. It's not going to happen automatically. You've got to get to a place where you train your mind. Okay. And so, I want to make sure that we understand those things and we practice those things. We put those things into place, right? So another thing that we want to do as learners, right? A really a good tip that I like to use in general, right? A really good study tip is that when you're in class, make sure you're engaging with the professor. Make sure that you're taking notes, right? Because a lot of students never had to take notes in high school or didn't know, nobody ever taught them how to take notes, they still don't know how to take notes, right? And so they ask questions about the most mundane things and want to write down everything. No, you should be able to take notes in class by understanding what are the more important concepts. That doesn't mean that I'm going to write everything that was said. That means that I understand by the inflection in my teacher's voice. I understand by virtue of the fact that they keep talking about a thing a couple of times that I need to be writing this down because this information is going to come back along the way, right? Even if I have to say, Professor Sane or Dr. Sane, could you go back to when you talked about literary criticism? I didn't really understand when you talked about this. When you So what happens is it's not good enough to say that you didn't understand something, right? You need to write down questions about what you don't understand because that's another very good study skill, another very good study tactic, right? Write down questions about the things that you don't understand. So if you don't understand when you're going through the research paper process, if you don't understand MLA documentation or APA documentation, make a note to yourself about what specifically you don't understand. And then that way, when you go back to class, you're able to ask your teacher very specific questions that help you comprehend. Because again, we're not trying to memorize anything. We're trying to make sure we understand, are able to process and apply what we've learned. Okay. So write down specifically what you didn't understand. And even when you're studying and reading material, make sure that you put questions. One of the things I always tell students that is extremely important while you're studying is you got to learn how to dialogue with the text. Dialogue with the text. Okay. Dialogue with the text. When you say, Dr. Hall, what does it mean to dialogue with the text? That means that as I'm reading the information, I'm asking specific questions about what it is that I've learned. I'm asking specific questions about what it is that I've learned. For example, I may ask some of the questions, especially when you're reading in literature classes, history classes, even your education courses, right? Who is the author, right? It's always important to understand who wrote something, right? Because whenever we understand who wrote something, that gives us a bit of context to understand why they wrote what they wrote, right? So let's say, for instance, if you're an education major and you're taking a course like um, teaching literature to middle schoolers, okay? So if you're taking this course teaching literature to middle schoolers, right? Then one of the things you want to make sure you're doing is you need to understand who wrote the material that you're teaching, right? Because uh, sometimes we can find things that help us connect with the information better, right? And so if I understand who wrote it and I have some type of background or context on the author or when the time frame that they wrote whatever was being written, it helped me to develop a better understanding of what it is that I'm reading. I'll say that again for the people in the cheap seats. When you understand who wrote a text, when the text was written, right? It helps you to understand the information that you were reading. For example, if I'm in a history class and my teacher or my professor has us reading, um, where she has us reading the speech by Dr. King called Discovering Lost Values. It's one of my favorite speeches by Dr. King, by the way. This Rediscovering Lost Values, that's the name of it, right? And so I'm reading this speech by Dr. King, and he talks about, in this speech, he's talking about how um, people are no longer going to church, and people are living in the same neighborhoods, but they don't know their neighbors, um, and that people now have the airplane and the newspaper, and they have TV that helps them know what is happening in all parts of the world, but people are less connected than they ever have been before, right? So first off, one of the things I'm going to be thinking about is when did Dr. King write this? Because most people are not reading newspapers nowadays, right? And with TV, a lot of people don't watch the news anymore. They get their news from the internet, right? Well, if I understand that Dr. King wrote this, Rediscovering Lost Values, I think maybe in the early 60s, right? I understand that during that time, it was still a lot of segregation in America. Um, Jim Crow was very real in a lot of areas of the South. See the history, you see the history connecting with this, right? Helping my comprehension. So then, what helps me when he said rediscovering lost values, and I also understand that Dr. King was a civil rights advocate. He fought for the rights of not just Black folks, but the rights of humanity, right? So and he calls this speech Rediscovering Lost Values. Well, I know a value means morals or ethics. And so if he's saying we lost them, he may be making reference to the lack of civil rights, the dehumanization of Black folks and other people in this country, right? He's making reference to those things. And then when he says that the world is now a neighborhood but ceases to be a brotherhood, it makes perfect sense to me. Because when I looked at those other things and I looked at the context and the time frame, it helped me to understand what it is that Dr. King was meaning by what he said. And so you can use that same skill set in every class, right? The same skill set that you make sure that you look at the context of what you're learning, because when you look at the context, it will also help you be able to understand how to apply what it is that you've learned. Okay. The last thing, right? Because I like to keep these at 45 minutes because I understand uh, that a lot of folks are still working on that attention span, all right? But one of the last things that I love to do, and I love for students to do, is to make sure that you quiz yourself about the information that you receive. Quiz yourself about the information that you receive, right? Quiz yourself about the information that you receive. So if you're in uh, a class from Dr. Egby and you know that you're getting ready to have a big quiz coming up soon, before Dr. Egby ever gives that quiz, you already know what you're going to cover. You're probably going to cover the information this information that he's discussed that's in your notes, right? So start quizzing yourself. Start quizzing yourself. Start asking yourself questions about the material that you already have in your possession. And sometimes it even helps to start study groups, right? Because what happens is that you will connect with other people who may have more material than you or better notes than you, and then you all can exchange information. I love the quote, "No one man is an island," right? So even though you're extremely bright, even though you're extremely engaged in class, you may not have gotten everything that you needed. So when you got a study buddy, somebody else who is equally engaged, you all can exchange information, you all can quiz one another. And what that helps to do is to make sure that you're prepared as you move forward. So again, um, we want to make sure, and I'm just kind of go back through these I want to kind of go back through these quickly, but I also want you to make sure that you email me at chall@philander.edu so that I can share this ebook. It's an ebook that we've created in the Office of Academic Affairs that will help you with this information as you move forward. So make sure that you email me and I'll share with you the presentation, the ebook, and also so you can take the quiz for extra credit. I need you to take this quiz for extra credit because I don't need you to play this video in the background and then say, well, Dr. So-and-so, I went to that lady's workshop series. Um, show and prove, boo. Okay, that's what we need. Show and prove. So again, I want to cover those things again. So when you're studying, before you start your studying process, number one, make sure you understand what type of learner you are. That's number one. What type of learner you are. Are you visual? Are you auditory? Are you kinesthetic? Okay. Number two, make sure that when you're in class, that you're actively taking notes, not taking pictures of the board. Because as I discussed, you usually erase them and you're not going to remember and be able to apply something simply because you took a picture of it. So you want to actively take notes in class. Number three, ask questions. Ask questions. As you read, you want to make sure you dialogue with the text. Meaning, what do I think the author is saying right here? What does this word mean? When you see a word that you don't understand, have you went to define that word? Have you highlighted it? Right? And define it so that you can make sure that you understand, because a lot of times when we don't do the necessary footwork, when you're reading something and you don't try to define the things that you don't understand, everything can get lost in translation. So you got to make sure that you keep a dictionary and a thesaurus on hand. Even if you look it up in your phone, make sure that you're writing down these things, right? So you want to ask questions and dialogue with the text. Number four, set aside chunks of time for studying. Set aside chunks of time for studying. So that may be 30 minutes before class. It may be an hour before bed, an additional hour before bed that you're going over your notes and rewriting notes, right? Then on the days when you don't have class and other responsibilities, or you don't work, because again, you're not working and you're not going to class 7 days a week. Cap if you say that you are. Okay. So you want to make sure that you're taking at least 2 to 3 hours on those days to study and go over the information. Maybe even start a study group where you get with other people in your classes to make sure that you're covering the information in a detailed form. And lastly, but definitely not least, don't memorize information. Memorize is not learning. Memorization is not learning. You want to make sure that you understand the information. And that means memorization plus application. Got to be able to apply what it is that I've learned. All right. So, uh, hopefully you'll share this video with your friends. We're going to be sharing clips of the video onto our social media pages. If you haven't already done so, make sure that you follow the Office of Academic Affairs on YouTube and subscribe to our page. Subscribe to our page on YouTube so that you're notified of upcoming workshops. Make sure that you like and follow on Instagram at PSC Academic Affairs. Make sure that you like, follow on TikTok, and like and follow on Facebook. Academic Affairs at Philander Smith College. And again, I thank you guys for your time and attention. Stay safe, stay warm, and have a wonderful Wednesday. Again, this is Dr. Carolyn Hall from the Office of Academic Affairs. I'm the Associate Vice President for Academic Affairs. Bye.